Hi guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel Medit. So in today's video we'll be talking about the joints present in human body, its anatomy, and by the completion of the video you guys will be able to define joint, its classification, and talk briefly about the synovial joints and also talk about the clinical aspects related to the joint. So without further ado, let's jump right into the topic. Now, before starting with the video, I want you guys all to process in your mind what exactly is a joint. Can you think about it? Basically, joint is a junction, right? Or a meeting point between the two skeletal elements. And here, skeletal element, I don't mean only a bone, right? It could also be a cartilage. So, the two skeletal elements where they meet, or a junction, is called as joint. Now, talking about the proper definition is what you actually require in your examinations. So, the joint is an articulation or a place of union or a junction between two or more bones, right? So, what's an articulation? So, basically, articulate means to meet, right? So, articulation is a place or the site where two or more bones meet. There are many types of joints and the classification can be made on various grounds. The first classification being the functional classification of joints, which means that the joints can be divided on the basis of the amount of movement that each joint allows. And it includes synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis and diarthrosis. So basically in anatomy, the term syn gives us an idea that it's fused. So, synarthrosis is the type of joint in which there is immobility. So, it's a kind of immovable joint. In the same way, amphiarthrosis. So, this is probably derived from the word amphibian. What are amphibians? Those are the organisms that can live in both land and water, right? So, it's like a partial. It gives us an idea that it's partial, right? So, amphiarthrosis. In amphiarthrosis, the joints have slight mobility, so those are slightly movable joints. And in diarthrosis means fully movable joints. In the same way, whenever a joint is formed, the two skeletal elements, that can be either bone or cartilage, as I have already mentioned, the two skeletal elements, for example bones, can be either joined by fibers or cartilages or by a membrane. So this classification is called as a structural classification because it is based upon the structure of the joint, right? How is it formed? So there can be fibrous joint, cartilaginous joints and synovial joints. Don't worry, we'll be talking about all of them individually later. The third classification of joints can be made on the basis of number of articulating bones that contribute to the joint formation. So there can be either simple joint, compound joint and complex joint, right? So, in simple joint, as the name itself suggests, the joint is formed simply. That means only two bones are taking part in the formation of the joint. In compound joint, there are more than two bones that take part in the joint formation. And in complex joint, the joint cavity or the cavity that is formed during the joint formation, that is itself divided by the presence of an articulating disc. Don't worry about this quite a lot now because you'll understand it eventually. So the example of complex joint is the temporomandibular joint and the knee joint. Last but not the least, the joints also can be classified on the basis of their regions or wherever they are present in the body, right? So the regional classification includes the skull type of joints, vertebral type of joint and limb type of joint. So the skull type of joint are usually present in the skull bones, which are immovable, and the vertebral type is present in the vertebra, which are slightly movable. And the limb type means you can freely move your hands, right? So they are freely movable, obviously. Now let's go to the details about the classification on the basis of structure or the structural classification, which included fibrous joint, cartilaginous joint and the synovial joints. In fibrous joints, I want you guys to understand that the bones are joined by a fibrous tissue or just fibers, let's say. And the fibrous joints are either immovable or permit slight degree of movement. And inside fibrous joints too, there are various other subtypes, which are sutures, syndesmosis and gomphosis. Now let's talk about them individually. Now you know that our skull is comprising of many bones, right? And can you move, okay, not your neck, but can you move the bones within your skull? Do you think it's possible? It's practically impossible, right? So the skull bones are connected by the help of sutures, and suture too is a type of joint. So suture is an immovable joint and it's primarily meant for growth. So as you can see in this diagram, the bony margins are quite irregular in a suture, right? And depending upon the shape of the bony margins, the suture can be further divided into plain, serrate, squamous, denticulate, which means a lambda type of shape. The second type of joint present in fibrous joint is syndesmosis. So syndesmosis basically is a fibrous union between the bones. As you can see in this diagram, there is an interosseous membrane. Okay, so interosseous means, inter means within the two and osseous means bones. So interosseous means within the two bones there is a presence of membrane, as you can see in this diagram. So it's a fibrous joint in which the articulating bones are joined by interosseous membranes or ligaments. Okay, so the examples you have to remember, they are the interosseous ligament as present in the tibiofibular joint, and the next type is interosseous talocalcanean ligament. So this is all the bones of the lower limb. Okay, the third type is the gomphosis. Gomphosis is a pig and socket type of fibrous joint in which the tooth is placed within the alveolar socket of the jawbone, and there is a presence of periodontal ligament in between the tooth and the alveolar socket, and this is a dense fibrous connective tissue. So basically gomphosis is the type of joint that is in the tooth and the alveolar bone. In cartilaginous joints, the bones are joined by the help of cartilage, and there can be any type of cartilage, either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage or any other type. I've talked about the cartilage and its type in our previous video on cartilage, so you can go through it once. The cartilaginous joints can be further divided into either primary cartilaginous joint or a secondary cartilaginous joint. Now let's begin with synchondrosis, or the primary cartilaginous joint, in which the bones are united by the help of a plate of hyaline cartilage, and the plate of the hyaline cartilage is later ossified, converting into a bone, and this process is called as a synostosis. So synchondrosis becomes synostosed. And the examples of hyaline cartilaginous joint or the primary cartilaginous joint are epiphyseal plate of cartilage that later converts into bone. Similarly, the next important example is the first chondrosternal joint that is present in between the sternum and the first rib. Also, all the costochondral joints present in between the ribs and the sternum is the primary cartilaginous joint. The secondary cartilaginous joint, also called as symphysis or a fibrocartilaginous joint, in which the articular surfaces of the bones that contribute in joint formation are covered by a hyaline cartilage, but the bones are united by a disc of fibrocartilage. So make this concept clear that the skeletal elements are connected by the help of a fibrocartilage, but the articular surfaces are covered by hyaline cartilage. This joint does not ossify in future and persists throughout the life. It's called as symphysis because it occurs in the median plane of the body and it permits limited movement. For example, when you try to move your backbone, you cannot move it completely like your limb, right? So it's a kind of limited movement. So the examples of secondary cartilaginous joint are the intervertebral joints, the pubic symphysis, and the manubriosternal joint. Lastly, in the functional classification of the joint, we have synovial joints. The synovial joint is the most evolved and the most mobile type of joint. Hence, it is classified functionally as diarthrosis. since they are freely movable joints. I have not mentioned this thing earlier, but remember that the synovial cavity is present only in synovial joint and not in other type of joint like the cartilaginous joint or your fibrous joints, right? So the articular surface, just like the fibrocartilage, is covered by articular cartilage, and in between the articular surfaces there is this joint cavity that is filled with the synovial fluid. So wherever there is a fluid, what is the main function? It's to lubricate or to provide lubrication, right? So lubrication, it helps in the free movement of any part, and the synovial fluid is secreted by synovial membrane itself. The synovial fluid comprises of hyaluronic acid and the interstitial fluid that is derived from the blood plasma. And as I have already mentioned that the presence of fluid provides lubrication, right? So the main function of synovial fluid is to reduce the friction by providing lubrication to the joint. Also, the synovial fluid supplies nutrients and removes metabolic waste product and comprises of phagocytic cells. So there is a clinical implication to this, that whenever we start to exercise, first of all we are recommended to do a warm-up, right? So the warm-up benefits before exercise, that it helps in the production of the synovial fluid so that the joint pain does not occur. And also there is one more thing, the old age group people usually complain of joint pain, and this mainly occurs due to the decrease in synovial fluid, due to which the lubrication of the joint is reduced and hence it leads to pain in the joint. According to the axis of the movement of the joints and the shape of the articular surfaces, the synovial joints can be further divided into plane, uniaxial, biaxial and polyaxial joints. In the plane type of synovial joint, the articular surfaces are more or less flat or plane, and it permits gliding or slipping type of movement, as you can see in this diagram. Since the bones glide upon one another and there is no specific axial movement, it is also called as a non-axial joint. Talking about the uniaxial joint, there are hinge joint and pivot joint. So first of all, let's talk about hinge joint. Hinge joint can be comparable to the hinge of a door, and the movement of this hinge joint is similar to the opening and closing of the door. The articular surfaces that contribute in joint formation are pulley shaped, and the examples of hinge joint are elbow joint, ankle joint, and the interphalangeal joint that is present in between the phalanges of your fingers. So try moving your elbow. Whenever you pull your hand in front of you and take it farther away, you can observe that the movement is similar like that of door opening and closing, right? So it's a hinge joint. In pivot joint, the articular surfaces comprises of a central bony pivot that is surrounded by osteoligament string. And as you can see in this figure, the central bony pivot is circular. So pivot basically means to rotate, and this joint too is a monoaxial one, since it allows rotation only around a single axis. And the example you have to remember is the atlantoaxial joint. In the biaxial joint, there are bicondylar joint and ellipsoid joint. The condyloid or the ellipsoidal joint is the type of joint in which the oval convex part fits into the elliptical depression. And the example you have to remember is the wrist joint. The last but not the least is the multiaxial or a polyaxial joint, which includes saddle joint and ball and socket joint. In saddle joint, one bone is saddle shaped, whereas the other bone fits like a person riding on the saddle of the horse. The example of saddle joint is the joint between femur and patella, and the next example is the first carpometacarpal joint, as you can see in the diagram. The ball and the socket joint is also called as a spheroidal joint, in which the ball fits into a cup-like depression, so it's called as a ball and a socket joint. It's called as a multi-axial joint because movement occurs in indefinite number of axes, and the example is your shoulder joint and your hip joint. You can move your shoulder all over in 360 degrees, right? so it's a multi-axial ball and socket joint. So summarizing the types of synovial joint, it comprises of planar joint, the hinge joint and pivot joint, which falls under the uniaxial joint, the condylar joint, which is a type of biaxial joint, and the multi-axial or the polyaxial type of joint are the saddle joint and the ball and socket joint. Now let's discuss briefly about the applied anatomy related to the joints. So in first we have the dislocation of the joint. So a dislocation, also called as luxation, is often caused by a sudden trauma on the joint, for example an impact or a sudden fall, and it occurs when there is an abnormal separation in between the bones present in the joint. A sprain is the stretching or tearing of ligaments, and the ligaments are the bands of fibrous tissue that is present in between the bones, and most commonly the sprain occurs in the ankle, called as an ankle sprain. Arthritis is the swelling and tenderness of one or more joints. Tenderness is the painful sensation whenever we touch the joint. Similarly, arthroscopy is a procedure for diagnosing and treating joint problems. Just like in endoscopy, a surgeon inserts a narrow tube through a small incision made through the joint, and in which a fiber optic video is attached, and the diagnosis is made on the basis of that visual. That's it for today. I hope this video was helpful to you all. And if you like the video, do give it a thumbs up and leave a subscription down below. Share it with your friends and help us grow more. Till then, made it for you.